Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so we begin Leviticus 2 today, and we will first read the passage. Leviticus chapter 2, verse 1. When anyone brings a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. He shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it, and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. And he shall take from it a handful of the fine flour and oil with all of its frankincense, and the priest shall burn this as its memorial portion on the altar, the food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is the most holy part of the Lord's offerings, the Lord's food offerings. So, okay, this passage is kind of the basic template for the rest of the chapter. Again, we are told when anyone, okay, not if anyone, when anyone, is expected that people will be regularly bringing this offering, which in English is translated grain offering. The Hebrew word is mincha. And mincha can also be translated as a gift. When Genesis chapter 4, Abel and Cain offered their offerings, both the offerings, the grain offering and the lamb offering, which they both, the two brothers offered. The narrator of Genesis uses the word mincha for both offerings. And the other word, just the offering itself, the word used is korban, which we are familiar with as we read the New Testament. The Pharisees were criticized by Jesus for dedicating things as korban to the Lord when they try to avoid giving support to their own parents. And they will say, oh, this is korban, I cannot give it to you, I've given it to the Lord. And then you notice that this is an offering of fine flour, and I will explain that this fine here, the word does not describe the texture of the flour, because it's a very rough, especially by today's standards, but it's a rough flour made from the semolina, the best part of the wheat, the kernel. And it involves oil and frankincense. And later on, we are told in verse 13, every offering also has salt in it. And the frankincense is, of course, inedible, so it is put in a small part of the offering and it's burnt. And the rest is burnt as a memorial portion, mentioned here. And the rest is a food offering, each share, a food offering to God. NIV translates it as food offerings also for this chapter, but in Leviticus chapter 1, they translated the same word as fire, offering made by fire. Sorry. The NIV uses the translation offering made to the Lord by fire. Okay, but it's probably food offering, which is the correct translation. And the food offering is also a food offering for the priests. Provision for the priests is the most holy part of this offering. And Leviticus says that it will be only eaten by Aaron and his sons, not even the families, only Aaron and his sons, and only eaten inside the tabernacle. Moving on, verse 4. This is more detail about the grain offering. Okay, so when you bring a grain offering baked in the oven as an offering, it shall be unleavened loaves of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers smeared with oil. And if your offering is a grain offering baked on a griddle, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil. You shall break it in pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. And if your offering is a grain offering cooked in a pan, it shall be made of fine flour with oil. So the first three verses deal with flour that's uncooked, and verses 4 to 7, it's flour that's cooked. So different ways of cooking. First is baking in the oven, mixed with oil as a bread loaf or as a wafer and smeared with oil. Or it can be baked on a griddle, cooked on a griddle, and it will be mixed with oil. But because it's flat, the griddle is flat, so it's more like a cracker. And so it's a bit dry and thin, and so it's crumbled. It is broken in pieces. Oil is poured on it, and then it's offered. And verse 7 is another way of cooking. It's cooked in a pan, and in this case, the pan is probably a deep pan. So this would be your deep pan pizza, yeah, or your deep fried, because there will be a lot more oil in the pan. So this would be the deep fried offering. So different ways of cooking, different utensils used in the kitchen. Verse 8. And you shall bring the grain offering that is made of these things to the Lord, and when it is presented to the priest, he shall bring it to the altar. And the priest shall take from the grain offering its memorial portion and burn this on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is the most holy part of the Lord's food offerings. So this food offering, a portion of it is burned up, and the rest is given to Aaron and his sons to eat. God's provision for the hard work they do. And this particular offering is burnt. So it is burnt as a pleasing aroma to the Lord, to appease God, to get favor from God. Verse 11, and this is the last type of grain offering. No grain offering that you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven nor any honey as a food offering to the Lord. As an offering of first fruits, you may bring them to the Lord, but they shall not be offered on the altar for a pleasing aroma. You shall season all your grain offerings with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant with your God be missing from your grain offering. With all your offerings, you shall offer salt. So there's a rule here that no leaven or honey will be used in the grain offering, except for one type of first fruit offering. Okay, verse 12, I'll tell you later on, it's a different offering from verse 14, which is also a first fruit offering. So there are two types of first fruits offering, but verse 12 is about an offering that you can use leaven and honey, but this offering is not burnt. It is not the actual grain offering. But verse 14 is the actual grain offering. If you offer a grain offering of first fruits to the Lord, you shall offer for the grain offering of your first fruits fresh ears, roasted with fire, crushed new grain. And you shall put oil on it and lay frankincense on it. It is a grain offering. And the priest shall burn as its memorial portion some of the crushed grain and some of the oil with all of its frankincense. It is a food offering to the Lord. So this particular type of first fruit offering is the fresh grain itself, and it's roasted and crushed, and oil and frankincense put on it. So let me do this in three parts. First, an introduction, then I'll talk about the meaning, and then application and introduction. I'll give you the context and the background. So this bingha, this gift, is a voluntary offering and is the second one listed in Leviticus. It is a food offering, ishshe, and this is mentioned in verses 2, 3, 10, and 16. Now, if you read the King James Version, it uses the word meat offering, and it becomes very confusing for modern readers of English because meat today is flesh. But in 1611, when they translated the word meat, they meant meal. So meal offering, this is the food offering, it's a meal offering. Now, of course, God does not need food, but in fact, this is God's provision for his workers. So ironically, it is the priests who eat the food, and they have to eat it only in the tent of meeting, verses 3:10, and Leviticus 6:16 tells us this. that it is to be eaten by the priests, holy people. The priests are considered the permanently holy people, and they are eating it in a permanently holy place, the tabernacle. And this is actually the same word mincha, describing Cain's gift in Genesis chapter 4. And the gift, therefore, and Abel's gift in that passage is also referred to as a mincha. So both of them, God regarded both gifts as the same. So it was not the gift that God rejected in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 to 5. Because sometimes when we read the passage, we say, why is it so unfair? We don't understand why God rejected Cain's grain offering and accepted Abel's lamb offering. And many pastors will explain, oh, because the lamb, a sacrifice must involve blood. I'll explain later on that is not the correct translation and interpretation. From God's question to Cain in Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 to 7, we know that it is Cain. It is obvious that Cain knew he had no right to be angry with God. God says, why are you angry? So God is telling telling Cain, you have no right to be angry. You know what I require for the offering. And what was that requirement? It was not that it is a grain offering instead of a lamb offering. I believe it is because of Cain's attitude or the motive. Inside his heart, Cain brought an acceptable, externally, Cain brought an acceptable offering for God, but inside his heart, there was something that God rejected. Maybe his pride, maybe some wrong motive. So Hosea 6:6 in the Old Testament, in fact, probably gives us a clue. God says, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. It's not the sacrifice that God is looking at. There must be steadfast love. And probably he had no love for his brother Abel. That's why he was so quick to kill his brother. So there was no love. And the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. God would prefer that you know him rather than be giving beautiful sacrifices. Because we are told in 1 Samuel 16:7, God sees the inside, humans see the outside. And we'll look at the offering and we wonder why the offering is rejected. It's actually not the offering, it is inside Cain's heart. There was something rotten inside there that God rejected. So back to Leviticus. As we read earlier on, there are 6 types of grain offering. First of all, the uncooked offering of semolina with oil poured on it, the so-called fine flour, which is actually a description not of the texture, but of the quality. This is premium flour, the best part of the wheat offering, the wheat flour. And then you either offer it uncooked, but even then you have a lot of work, right, to grind it into a premium flour and separate all the other lesser parts of the kernel that produces the lesser quality flour. So there's a lot of work involved there. Some would then prefer to cook it before they offer it. And so Leviticus says there are 4 types of cooked offering. One is the loaf mixed with oil and baked in an oven. And the other one is also baked in the oven, wafers smeared with oil, verse 4. And another type would be the flat bread or the crackers baked with oil in a griddle. And because it's crispy, it's crumbled first, and then oil is poured on top. So there's a lot of oil, and this is olive oil, yeah, verses 5 to 6. And then finally, the fine flour that is cooked in a pan that's been mixed with oil and probably deep fried because it's a deep pan, verse 7. And then the last type of grain offering called the first fruit, verses 12 and 14. And actually there are 2 types here. If you look at the Hebrew, verse 12, the Hebrew word used is reshit, and verse 14, the Hebrew word used is bikurim. So there are 2 different types of first fruits, and the verse 12 type is not the grain offering, but the verse 14 type is a grain offering. It is an offering to win favor from God, and it is a pleasing aroma to God. And that's verse 14, the bikurim. And the bikurim is a fresh, crushed, new grain It's newly harvested and it's roasted. As I suppose it's still very hard to crush to mill and produce as flour. So it is just crushed and roasted. And if you read the Hebrew later on in Leviticus 23, verse 15 and onwards, and Numbers 28, verse 26 onwards, the Bikurim is mentioned again, but that Bikurim there is for the harvest festival, so it's probably a different first fruit also. Okay, so the grain offering first fruit is a very special offering. It is crushed new grain and it's roasted. So different ways of cooking. Now, the offering of premium flour, again, it reminds us we give our best to God, just like when you give the Leviticus 1 burnt offering, it is of a male, unblemished lamb, the best part of the flock, the most precious part of the flock. And then a portion of this is taken out by the priest and burnt up, verses 2, 9, and 16. And this portion, after it's burnt, the rest is eaten up by the priests, verses 3 and 10. And of course, the grain offering of the priests themselves would also give offerings for their own sins. But when that grain offering is given by the priest, Leviticus 6:23 tells us that it is completely burnt up. Okay, because the priest himself is the offerer, he doesn't eat from that offering. And verse 12, the rishit, as I mentioned, is not an offering for a pleasant aroma. It is a separate type of offering. And the Bikurim of verses 14 to 16 is the grain offering that we're talking about here. Okay, so what's the meaning of this passage? First, a bit more background. The grain offering can be offered by itself, as here in Leviticus 2. But usually, as you read the Old Testament, it is offered together with other offerings. It is offered together with a burnt offering or a peace offering, and there will be a libation offering, a drink offering that's mentioned here in Leviticus 14 and Leviticus 23, the burnt offering and peace offering and drink offering offered together with the grain offerings. Now, Leviticus 5:11 gives us a very interesting detail. Last week, when we looked at Leviticus 1, we are told that the burnt offering should be a lamb or a bull, but for those who are too poor, lamb, bull, or goat, and for those who are too poor, they could offer a pigeon or a turtle dove. And for the grain offering, again, if you're too poor to offer the grain, you could offer 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. Okay. And for those who are even poorer than that, for those who can't even afford the pigeon or the turtle dove, Leviticus 5:11 tells us that they can use the grain offering. Okay, so it does look like maybe just a little bit of grain offering. They can't afford the 2 turtle doves, but they can bring a little bit of grain offering to offer it as a sin offering. So the sin offering, usually you need to slaughter an animal, but if you're too poor to buy a goat or cow or whatever, you still can use the grain offering, a little bit of flour to substitute for the animal. So I think what it tells us, as we look carefully, it really tells us that God is not being demanding and unreasonably demanding. If you're really, really poor, you don't need to buy an animal, you can't afford it. So worshiping God, then the lesson here is worshiping God is not an exclusive activity of those who are rich, who have something to spare for God. It is for everybody, no matter how poor we are. Now, verse 11 tells us that the offering must not contain leaven or honey. And the reason probably is Leviticus 2 doesn't tell us why, but the scholars and the rabbis think that it is because leaven represents corruption. Jesus himself used leaven in 2 different stories. In one story, he talks about the kingdom of God being like leaven. It grows and grows and grows. And in other contexts, he talks about the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of the corrupt people of Israel. So leaven can represent corruption and sin. And honey speeds up fermentation because the sugar, it's the yeast that consumes the sugar and produces gas that makes the leaven rise. So 1 Corinthians 5:8, Paul uses leaven in that context of corruption and sin. So honey and leaven can be used, excuse me. Honey and leaven can be used in the first fruit offering, the reshit of verse 12, because that offering is not burnt up. But honey and leaven cannot be used in any other offering that has to be burnt. So this is a clear rule from Leviticus. And we find that all that offering, all the fine flour offering, this is all cooked in olive oil, either mixed in or poured in or used to cook. So lots of olive oil there. And all the offerings, verse 13, we are told, all the offerings must be seasoned with salt. That also includes the burnt offering, right? All offerings. And it is to be salted with the salt of the covenant with your God, verse 13. Very specific words, and I'll explain that. And then there is also frankincense, and frankincense is a very expensive ingredient. It is only grown in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula and in Somaliland. Very, very rare conditions needed to grow this bush, and so it is very expensive and it's very fragrant. It cannot be eaten. It's bitter, but so it's not used for the food part of it. It's used for the burning part of it, so that there's a real fragrance in the temple. Now, Hebrews 9:22 tells us that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So this is why most pastors would try to explain Cain and Abel's story as Abel's sacrifice was accepted because there was shedding of blood. But the grain offering in Leviticus 2 is a plant offering. So it's a bloodless offering. So can a bloodless offering be a real sacrifice? Obviously it is, right? Otherwise it won't be in Leviticus 2. It is a real sacrifice. Now, some scholars look at Leviticus 1:4 and say, oh, there the burnt offering is specifically mentioned as being given for atonement, and there is no word atonement in Leviticus 2, so maybe the grain offering is not for atonement. I don't think so, because if we read further in Leviticus 5:13, the grain offering is also mentioned as something that can give atonement. So because in Leviticus 5:11 to 13, this is the grain offering offered by the poor person who cannot afford an animal. And so God says, you can do your sin offering using the grain offering. God is gracious and merciful, and he doesn't make unreasonable demands. So this bloodless sacrifice can be a real sacrifice. In any case, the word sacrifice, that's in English, it comes from the Latin. Actually, it doesn't even refer to death. In the Hebrew, of course, the more relevant language, it is a translation usually of the word korban, and korban is not something that implies blood. Korban is anything that we have that belongs to us, that is set aside and given to God. So that's korban, and it doesn't have to be an animal. It could be our land, it could be our houses, it could be anything we have. So if you look at a grain offering, it is an offering of a living sacrifice. The grain is living, right? And so in Romans 12:1, Paul talks about Christians being the living sacrifices. It sounds contradictory, but it is correct. A sacrifice can be of a living person, the Christian who loves and serves God. Now, all offerings have to be salted, and the salt is the covenant, is representative of the covenant with God. And in the ancient world, salt had two main purposes. One as a preservative of food, because they didn't have refrigerators, and also as a food flavoring agent to make food taste better. And because salt was considered indestructible by fire, it was also used to signify permanent bonds. So if you want to seal a friendship, you eat salt together with your new friend. And treaties were signed and salted. So the salt was an indication that this treaty is permanent, and it commemorates the treaty that we are signing. It commemorates the friendship, the human bonding. And so God asked Moses to put this into the offerings given to God. And the salt is a symbol and a reminder of God's covenant with Israel on Mount Sinai, where God says, I have delivered you, and now obey me, be my people, you are my priests, you are my mediators between humans and God. And to mark this treaty signed with God, so to speak, there was a ceremony, and God says it is salt that represents this treaty between God and people. So therefore, whenever Israel sacrificed, it was reminded of the covenant they had with God, to obey him and to be blessed by him for their obedience. And in the New Testament, we are called by Jesus to be the salt of the earth, Matthew 5:13, which means we are to preserve society from corruption and to flavor society so that it is a more pleasant and livable place. And we are reminded to season our speech with salt. Paul tells us in Colossians 4:6, that means to be gracious and gentle in our speech, especially to non-believers, so that they would have a good view of God and those who follow him. Now back to Leviticus 2, we are, depending on the translation we read in English, we're told that there is a token portion. That's the NRSV translation. The NLT version talks about a representative portion, but most other English versions like the NIV, ESV talks about a memorial, which is a remembrance. A memorial is a remembrance. So this is a memorial portion. The Hebrew word being translated is the word azkara. And azkara is based on the root word zakah, which means to remember. So from the root zakah, azkara can mean something that we use for remembrance. The problem is that God is not a forgetful person. So why would he need a reminder? He does not need to be reminded. So why does Moses talk about a memorial portion? So that's why some of the other translations use the word token. It is the small part of the big part. It's a representative portion of the offering that's being burnt. But memorial is an okay translation, right? Because when you talk about anthropomorphism, that means we talk about God as if he has hands and legs and he is a human being. When we talk about God remembering in the Old Testament, it always follows with an act. When God remembers Israel, he acts in favor of Israel. God remembers Israel was enslaved and God delivered them. He acts whenever he remembers. So the memorial is probably a correct translation. It is a memorial of two things. One is it is a human memorial for humans to remember God, and it's a memorial in the sense of we are frail human beings trying to remind God, please remember us in mercy. So in reality, of course, humans are the ones that need to remember. They need to remember God's goodness, God's greatness, and his delivery from Egypt, delivery of the Israelites from Egypt, delivery of ourselves from sin. And this is a reminder every time they sacrifice of the covenant to Israel on Mount Sinai. And every time the offering is made, the human offerer is reminded of God's favors. So in a way, looking at it from a human point of view, the grain offering is a tribute to the sovereign God, our King, who rules over us. And tributes are given to kings. Tributes are gifts declaring our acknowledgement that we belong to God. And there are gifts proclaiming our gratitude and loyalty to God, to the King. And since this is an offering to appease God, yeah, the words used are a food offering with a pleasing aroma to God. Verse 2, God remembers that we are frail creatures in need of his mercy, grace, and favor whenever this offering is made. And as he remembers, he will act, he will bless us, and he has already acted by sending Jesus to die on a cross for us. And so we are forever blessed. In Leviticus chapter 1, we noted that the offerer participates in the sacrificial ceremony primarily by choosing an animal from his flock, and then by bringing it to the tabernacle. It's a bit of effort. And he also helps to cut the animal and to skin the animal. So he is participating in the worship. In Leviticus 2, we notice that the offerer here not only brings the offering, he chooses the offering, he brings it to the temple, but he has to grind it into flour, he has to crush it, and he has to cook it. So that's lots more work, giving the grain offering. The cooking methods here, however, they are not strange to the Israelites. They are normal cooking methods, and the normal cooking utensils and ovens and pans, they are the very ones that they would be using in the kitchens of the ordinary Israelites. So we can see that the Israelites had to work very hard to prepare for the worship. And not only did they work hard for the worship, they were using ordinary things that they own already. This is food from their own diet. These are tools from their own kitchens, and they are skills, ordinary skills that they use daily to cook their own meals. So everything is ordinary, but where God is concerned, it becomes extraordinary. Work is worship, and worship is work. The Israelites worked in order to worship, to prepare for worship, and as they worshipped, they were working to cutting the animal and skinning it and crushing the grain and so on. So work is worship, and worship is work. There is no work, no tool, no skill too useless or too small for God's purposes. And when we get bogged down by our work and we become discouraged, we need to remember that all work is worship. In fact, the Greek word liturgia, from which we get the English word liturgy, and the Hebrew word abad, both words for work can also be translated worship. Liturgia and abad can also be translated worship. It's the same word, work and worship. So I think the Greeks and the Hebrews had the right attitude. We need to work when we worship. Modern worship in many churches, however, is like a concert. We're just watching, we're just observing, we're passive, we're not even participating. So what are the lessons we draw from Leviticus chapter 2? The first lesson is what we learned last week. Sacrifice does not need shedding of blood, Romans 12:1. It can be the praise of our lips, Hebrews 13:15. It could be our worship, 1 Peter 2:5. It could be just loving God and loving others, Mark 12:33, Ephesians 5:2. Worship is a sacrifice is serving others and doing good, Hebrews 13:16. It is our gifts to God's servants, Philippians 4:18. Paul says, your gifts to me are a fragrant offering to God. And Psalm 51:17, of course, tells us that our broken and contrite hearts, that is a sacrifice more valuable to God than the animal sacrifice. Second lesson we learned is that no work is too mundane or too inconsequential for God. Work is not a curse. That's a wrong teaching. We were not cursed with work. We were created for work. God created us for work. God himself worked in Genesis 1. And before the fall, in Genesis chapter 2, God put Adam into the garden to tend the garden and to name the animals. So he was the first biologist. He was the first gardener. He was working, and God's goodwill for Adam and Eve was to work in a beautiful paradise. Work was not meant to be a curse. And so when the fall came, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, the fall is described in Genesis 3. The curse is not work. The curse is painful work, painful toil, not the work itself, but the physical pain of having muscle aches and broken bones when we do hard work. The third lesson we gain is that worshiping God requires hard work. Worship is work, and if this is not true in our lives, we may not be following God well. And if our churches encourage us by what they call worship, in which everything is done for us and we just sit back and relax, that is not worship. The audience is God. It is not us. We are not going to church to watch a concert. We are the worshippers and God is the audience, not the other way around. So is our worship too casual, too professional? We get professional singers and musicians. Are we grateful for the opportunity that we have to be able to worship him? There are many people, many places that God cannot be worshipped by his followers. Also, I think the Bible reminds us very frequently that doing good is worship. So let us not be weary in doing good, because our labor in the work of the Lord is not in vain. And this is a message from 2 Thessalonians 3:13, 1 Corinthians 15:58. Our labor for God is not in vain, and that is worship. Fourth, hard work is worship. When we work hard, we must remember work is worship. Work is God's gift to us. And when work becomes tedious and burdensome, this is something that we need to remind ourselves more frequently. Sometimes we think that the way out of tedious work is to find new work. But how do you know that the new work will not be even more tedious and burdensome? It is perhaps more your attitude. Our attitudes make our work tedious and burdensome. But if we were to go to work with the attitude, I'm going to church. We go to church with the attitude, I'm going to work. Yeah, the reverse, right? We are going to work, to the office, to the factory, to the work site, and we are going there to worship God. And as we work, we worship God. And I think when we do that, we will begin to realize the work is a joy. Work is not tedious because it is worshiping God. Are we grateful to God for the work we have, especially in these difficult times? Many people have no jobs. Many people have jobs that are not real jobs. They pretend to be working, but there is very unproductive work. There isn't very much that they are actually doing. And particularly if you're working from home, maybe you're not really working at all. Are we grateful that we have somebody paying us for our work? Many homemakers don't get paid for the work, but they are grateful because God gives them gifts to take care of their families. Are we grateful to God that we have breath because we are living? And if we can work, that means we are living. Do we exclude God from our workplace? Monday to Friday, we go to work and we don't remember God at all. And we only remember God for an hour and a half on Sunday. There's a very little space given to God. So remember, work is worship. Worship is work. 5, we are called to be the salt of the earth. Salt reminded Israel of its covenant as God's priests, as mediators between God and humans. And Exodus 19:6 says they are the priests of God. Israel was supposed to be the priests of God. They forgot, they lost their way, and Jesus had to come to be the real Israel, to be the real high priest, so that we can return and be reconciled to God. And so as Christians, 1 Peter 2:19 reminds us that we are God's priests. We are a royal priesthood, a kingdom of priests that Israel was supposed to be, but failed to be. We are salt. We preserve our societies morally, and we are social flavoring agents. We make our societies more pleasant, more livable. We make it a better place wherever we go, whether at work or in the office or in school. We change the environment. I remember one of my friends was a pastor, and in Singapore we have national service. So after basic training and after he left the 2 years of national service, all of us, we go in for reserve training every year. And as a pastor, he is not exempted, so he goes in for reserve training every year. And he is in a platoon of soldiers. They all know he's a pastor, and the soldiers, some of them are poorly educated, some of them are very little educated, maybe just elementary school education. And so they are rough and tough people, and they speak words that are full of profanity and four-letter words and so on. But my friend, the pastor, says, every time I walk into the room, they all go shh, because they say, Pastor is here. This is a holy man. Let's not use our profane words anymore. So in that small way, this pastor was flavoring his platoon, because every time he's present, they try and speak nicer words. And we ourselves as Christians, we are also supposed to be salty, gracious in our speech. As we speak to others, we must be gentle and gracious so that they can see God's glory through our behavior. 6, we give our very best to God. God deserves, God, in fact, is entitled to our very best. Whatever we do it excellently, even if it's tedious and mundane work. What we have belongs to God anyway, and have been given by Him for us to use to serve Him and to serve the people He loves. So when we work, we also give our very best to our employers, being worship to God. And worship that costs nothing is worth nothing. In 2 Samuel 24:24, David wanted to give an burnt offering for his sins, and he was at this farm, this field, and he wanted to buy it from the owner, and the owner says, I'm going to give it to you. And David says, look, I am the one who's going to give the burnt offering, and if it costs nothing, it is worth nothing. Essentially, that's what he said. I will not offer anything to God that costs me nothing. So the grain offering is a gift to God, is a tribute to the sovereign God, our ruler. It is an expression of loyalty and gratitude and acknowledgement that we belong to Him. Do we give to God with that in mind? Whether it's money or time or our labor, do we give it as an expression of loyalty and gratitude to Him? And also remember this, none of us are too poor to offer something to God. No matter how poor we have, there is something we can give. And my wife and I, before we were married, we met at a mission trip to Indonesia. We went to this very poor region in Indonesia, up in the mountains, and we worshiped with them on a Sunday. and they're too poor to bring money. They don't have money at all. And so I was very puzzled. One Sunday worship, I saw the worshippers come, and they were carrying big blocks of stone. And I asked Pastor, what are they doing, or why are they bringing the stone to the church? And the pastor says, that's their tithe to God. With the stones they bring, when there are enough stones, we build the walls of the church. So no one, they had no walls, so they bring the stones to build a wall. And they were using their labor and the time. They walk, some of them walk 5 hours from where they live to the church. So no one is too poor to offer something to God, even if it's in kind. 7, God provides for us. God provides the harvest, of course. He gives the weather that grows the plants, and he gives us strength to go harvest it. And then we need to cook it and grind it and cook it so that we can bring it as an offering to God. So God provides for us. The tension here in the Bible always is there seems to be God's part and there seems to be my part, and there is this tension, this contradiction almost there. God provides for us, we say, but at the same time we must work. God provides and we work. Seems to contradict, right? Because the Thessalonians, Paul was writing to them, they seem to take the attitude that God provides so we don't have to work. So they were idling. And Paul says, you're not busy, you're busybodies. And they are interfering in other people's lives. So God's word, Paul writes in 2 Thessalonians 3 verses 10 to 12, everyone must work. You must not be idle. If you don't work, you will not eat. So we must work and earn our own living, even though we believe God provides for us. It's a tension that both are true at the same time. So God takes care, especially of those who work for him. The priests in the temple, they had no economic activity except, to be cutting and burning the animals and the offerings day in, day out, and to keep the fire burning on the altar and so on. So they had to be provided for, and God provided for them. And this is a principle that Paul reminds us constantly in 1 Corinthians, in Galatians, in 1 Timothy 5, that the workers of God's gospel, the ministers of God's gospel, they are to be provided for by the giving of those who are ministered to. And Galatians 6:6, I like that very much, that we are to share all good things with those who teach us the word of God. Hudson Taylor said, the missionary, he went to China, he started China Inland Mission, which has become the Overseas Missionary Fellowship. Hudson Taylor said, God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. And this is the dictum that Dorothy and I have always remembered as we serve God all the years that we have been serving God. God provides in miraculous ways for the work that we do for him. Any questions?
Should give me some example how he provides for us.